He, along with Saint Teresa of Avila, reformed the Carmelite Order. He was imprisoned and wrote several works that contributed to the Church. Today's curiosities are about Saint John of the Cross. Here are 13 curiosities about him. 13. Birth. Saint John of the Cross was born on June 24, 1542, in the small village of Fonteveros, in the province of Avila, Spain. His baptismal name was Juan de Yepes Alvarez. He came from a humble family. His father, Gonzalo de Yepes, was from a wealthy, upper-class family but was disinherited for marrying Catalina Alvarez, a poor weaver. Together, they had 3 children, including John. After the early death of John's father, the family faced severe financial difficulties, and his mother, Catalina, had to move with her children in search of better living conditions. John had 2 brothers, Francisco, the eldest, and Luis, who died as a child. Their precarious financial situation meant that John had a childhood marked by deprivation, but despite this, he showed a great religious vocation from an early age and a strong desire to pursue a spiritual life. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure to do so to not miss any curiosities about the saints. 12. Carmelite Reform. The Carmelite Reform was an essential movement in the history of Christian spirituality, led by Saint John of the Cross and Saint Teresa of Avila. Their goal was to restore the Carmelite order to its roots of contemplative, ascetic, and impoverished life, seeking greater closeness to God through simplicity and renunciation. The reform began in the 16th century, in a context of spiritual decline within the Carmelite order. The Carmelite monasteries were drifting away from the rigorous life of prayer and detachment that characterized the original Carmelite tradition. Saint Teresa of Avila was the first to recognize the need for revitalization, seeking to return to more austere and simple practices. She founded the first reformed monasteries for women, known as Discalced Carmelites, named for their adoption of simple sandals or walking barefoot, symbolizing poverty and humility. Saint John of the Cross was invited by Saint Teresa to help reform the male branch of the order. Together, they founded the first convent of Discalced Carmelites in 1568, in Derulo, Spain. Their vision was to re-establish the strict discipline of the order, focusing on contemplative prayer, silence, fasting, and communal life, maintaining poverty and distancing from material comforts. The reform was not easy. They faced strong opposition from within the order itself, particularly from the Calced Carmelites, who resisted the strict changes proposed. John of the Cross, in particular, suffered imprisonment and persecution during this process, but his faith and determination sustained him in the mission to reform the Carmelites. 11. Imprisonment and Writing. For 9 months, Saint John of the Cross was imprisoned by the Calced Carmelites in Toledo due to his involvement in the Carmelite Reform. The imprisonment was a time of great physical and spiritual suffering, marked by extremely harsh conditions, including an unsanitary environment, poor nourishment, and psychological torture. He was held in a dark, cramped cell with little room to move. Despite these adverse circumstances, Saint John of the Cross's imprisonment became one of the most fruitful periods of his life in terms of literary and spiritual production. During this time, he wrote some of his most important mystical and poetic works, such as Spiritual Canticle and parts of the Dark Night. These texts profoundly express his experience of mystical union with God, as well as the suffering and purification necessary to achieve that union. The experience in prison symbolizes, for him, the dark night of the soul, a spiritual process in which a person is stripped of all earthly and spiritual consolations, being purified to reach a closer union with God. The darkness of the cell, the solitude, and the pain he endured became metaphors for a spiritual journey of detachment and total surrender to the divine will. Upon his release, his literary and mystical works had been profoundly enriched by this experience of suffering and contemplation. The poems and mystical treatises written during this time are still considered sublime expressions of Christian spirituality, offering a path for those seeking a deeper relationship with God through renunciation and detachment. Leave your prayer request in the comments so that Saint John of the Cross may intercede for it before God. 10. Spiritual Doctrine. The spiritual doctrine of Saint John of the Cross is centered on the idea that true union with God can only be achieved through a profound process of inner emptying. According to him, humans must detach completely from themselves, their wills, desires, and attachments, both material and spiritual, to reach divine union. This process of detachment is what he called the dark night of the soul, where a person undergoes purification and desolation, deprived of all earthly and heavenly consolations and securities. The essence of his doctrine is that the creature is nothing, and God is everything. This means that humans, in their imperfect nature, cannot fully unite with God without first being emptied of everything imperfect or limited. Attachment to material goods, sensory satisfactions, one's virtues, and even spiritual consolations must be left aside, for only then can the soul be filled with the divine presence in a pure and total way. This emptying process is not just an external renunciation but a profound transformation of the soul. A person must renounce their ego and pride and surrender entirely to God's will. Only after going through this spiritual death can the soul experience true life in God, which is the mystical and full union with Him. St. John of the Cross teaches that this path of purification is painful and demanding, but it is also the only path to holiness and spiritual perfection. His spiritual doctrine is both a message of detachment and total trust in God, where the soul, emptied of everything, is finally filled with divine light and love. For those interested in acquiring the books of St. John of the Cross, I will leave a link in the video description. 9. Mystical poetry. St. John of the Cross is widely recognized for his mystical poetry, which serves as a sublime expression of his deep love and union with God. His poetry captures the essence of his spiritual experiences and his pursuit of divine perfection, offering a rich and intense vision of the spiritual life. The poetry of St. John of the Cross is characterized by symbolic and metaphorical language that seeks to convey profound mystical experiences. He uses images like light and darkness, fire and water, to describe the process of purification and the union of the soul with God. His works are known for their literary beauty and spiritual depth and are often referenced in his theological writings and spiritual literature. 8. Metaphor of fire and wood. St. John of the Cross uses the metaphor of fire and wood to illustrate the spiritual process of the soul's purification, offering a profound and vivid vision of the mystical journey. In this metaphor, the wood represents the human soul, while the fire symbolizes the divine presence of God. The process of purification is described in 3 distinct phases, each reflecting an aspect of the spiritual path toward union with God. In the first phase, the drying of the wood, St. John of the Cross describes the initial process of purification, where the soul begins to strip away earthly attachments and desires. This drying is a metaphor for eliminating worldly imperfections and cravings that prevent the soul from fully approaching God. It is a period where the soul is stripped of its inclinations and personal wills, preparing itself for a deeper transformation. The second phase is the blackening of the wood. In this stage, the soul undergoes a more intense and painful purification. The blackening symbolizes the trials and suffering that accompany this deeper spiritual purification. It is a phase where the soul faces spiritual darkness and an inner void, a necessary process to cleanse and purify the soul of its remaining impurities. This period of darkness is essential in preparing the soul for a more complete union with God. Finally, the third phase is the transformation of the wood into fire. In this stage, the soul, now purified and transformed, unites fully and completely with God. The fire symbolizes the mystical union with God, where the soul becomes one with the divinity, losing its individuality and being consumed by the divine presence. This state of union represents the ultimate fulfillment of the soul's spiritual desire and the culmination of the purification process. This metaphor of fire and wood offers a clear and powerful vision of the spiritual process described by St. John of the Cross. It illustrates the complex and often painful journey of purification, which is necessary to achieve a deep and true union with God. The image of fire, with its ability to transform and purify, highlights the depth and seriousness of the spiritual quest toward divine fullness. 7. Dark night of the senses and spirit. The distinction between the dark night of the senses and the dark night of the spirit is a crucial aspect of St. John of the Cross's doctrine, representing different stages of the spiritual purification process that he describes. The dark night of the senses refers to an initial stage of purification in which God withdraws the sensory and emotional consolations from the spiritual life. During this phase, the soul experiences a loss of the spiritual and emotional sensations that once brought comfort and joy. This withdrawal of consolation serves to detach the soul from dependence on sensory and emotional experiences, forcing it to rely more fully on God. It is a necessary process for detaching from earthly rewards and sensory gratifications, preparing the soul for a purer and more selfless relationship with the divine. This phase is often marked by a sense of spiritual dryness, where the soul may feel abandoned and directionless. The dark night of the spirit, on the other hand, is a deeper and rarer stage of purification. Here, God works to purify the soul's faith and theological virtues in a more intense and comprehensive manner. This phase involves a spiritual darkness that goes beyond sensory dryness. it is an experience of desolation and opacity in faith, where the soul is enveloped in an internal darkness that challenges its deepest convictions. The dark night of the spirit is a process aimed at cleansing the soul of all erroneous inclinations and understandings of God, promoting a purer and more selfless faith. The soul faces a spiritual crisis where all forms of consolation and certainty seem absent, and it must continue to believe and trust in God despite the absence of light and understanding. These two phases are integral parts of the mystical journey described by St. John of the Cross, each playing a crucial role in the path toward perfect union with God. 6. Detachment from heavenly goods. The concept of detachment from heavenly goods, according to St. John of the Cross, goes beyond simply renouncing earthly possessions. It involves a deeper and more comprehensive detachment, which includes not only the rejection of material pleasures and possessions but also the detachment from one's own spiritual desires and expectations of heavenly rewards. For St. John of the Cross, true detachment requires a person to move beyond the desire for spiritual rewards and divine blessings. This means that the individual must free themselves not only from material attractions and possessions but also from the yearning for spiritual consolations and gratifications. Instead of seeking God for rewards or mystical experiences He may provide, true love for God must be pure and selfless, motivated solely by the desire to love and serve God in Himself. This type of detachment is an expression of a higher and more authentic love. While many people may seek God for promises of salvation, peace, or spiritual fulfillment, true detachment requires a person to love God simply for who He is, regardless of rewards or associated feelings. It is a love not conditioned by expectations or benefits but directed toward the divine being itself. St. John of the Cross emphasizes that this level of detachment is essential to achieving a deep and true union with God. It is a process involving the purification of the heart and mind, removing all personal and selfish interests to fully open oneself to the experience of divine love. 5. Servile and mercenary love. St. John of the Cross makes an important distinction between different forms of love for God, emphasizing the need to transcend servile love and mercenary love to achieve a purer and more authentic relationship with the divine. Servile love is characterized by motivations based on the fear of punishment or the desire to avoid suffering. Those who practice servile love seek God primarily to avoid eternal suffering or to ensure their own spiritual security. This type of love is driven by concern for one's own well-being and a desire for protection, rather than by a genuine and selfless love for God. While legitimate and an important starting point, it is still centered on the individual's needs and fears. On the other hand, mercenary love is driven by the interest in the rewards that God can grant. Here, the person seeks God not so much for who He is but for what they can receive in return, such as blessings, graces, or spiritual achievements. This type of love is a way of negotiating with God, in which the individual engages with the divine expecting something in return, whether in the present or the future. St. John of the Cross teaches that true love for God must transcend these more selfish motivations. He proposes that one should aspire to a love that is not influenced by rewards or punishments but is motivated solely by the very essence of God. This pure and selfless love seeks God for who He is, not for what He can offer. It is a love that gives itself fully without expecting anything in return, reflecting a relationship of intimacy and total dedication. To reach this level of love, a person must undergo a process of purification that removes personal interests and selfish motivations. This process involves detaching from expectations of rewards and abandoning concerns for one's own benefit. Instead, the focus must be on loving God for His own essence, recognizing and revering His unconditional greatness and goodness. This type of love is the culmination of a spiritual journey aimed at achieving a true and deep union with the divine, where the relationship is marked by total surrender and selfless devotion. To reach this level of love, a person must undergo a process of purification that removes personal interests and selfish motivations. This process involves detachment from the expectations of rewards and the abandonment of concerns for one's own benefit. Instead, the focus should be on loving God for His essence, recognizing and revering His unconditional greatness and goodness. This type of love is the culmination of a spiritual journey aimed at achieving true and deep union with the divine, where the relationship is marked by total surrender and selfless devotion. 4. Works. St. John of the Cross is widely recognized for his literary and theological contributions, which are fundamental to understanding Christian mystical spirituality. His four main works are the Ascent of Mount Carmel, the Dark Night, the Spiritual Canticle, and the Living Flame of Love. Each of these works explores profound aspects of the Christian experience, offering a detailed vision of the spiritual path and union with God. The Ascent of Mount Carmel is a treatise that describes the process of spiritual purification necessary to achieve union with God. In this work, St. John of the Cross uses the metaphor of climbing a mountain to illustrate the Christian spiritual journey. The book focuses on the purification of the soul, which involves detachment from all that is earthly and the overcoming of passions and desires that hinder true union with God. The Dark Night is perhaps St. John of the Cross's most well-known work and is divided into two parts, the Dark Night of the Senses and the Dark Night of the Spirit. In this work, he details the periods of dryness and desolation that a Christian may face during the purification process. The Dark Night of the Senses refers to the phase in which God withdraws sensory consolations to help the individual detach from spiritual rewards. The Dark Night of the Spirit is a deeper and more painful phase, where God purifies faith and theological virtues, leading to an experience of spiritual darkness in which the soul must trust in God without sight. The Spiritual Canticle is a poetic work expressing deep love and mystical union with God. Using rich and symbolic language, St. John of the Cross describes the soul's spiritual journey in search of union with the divine. The poetry is an expression of contemplative experience and the passionate love between the soul and God and is considered one of the masterpieces of Spanish mystical literature. The Living Flame of Love is another key work in which St. John of the Cross explores the nature of divine love and the transformation of the soul through union with God. In this work, he uses the metaphor of fire to describe how God's love purifies and transforms the soul, leading it to a profound and radiant union with the divine. 3. Comparison with Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. The spirituality of Saint Thérèse of the Child Jesus, also known as Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, reflects a practical and accessible approach to love and trust in God, strongly influenced by the teachings of St. John of the Cross. Thérèse, although living in a very different context from that of St. John of the Cross, shares with him an emphasis on the depth of the relationship with God, but presents it in a way that is both simple and profound. Saint Thérèse developed what became known as the Little Way, a form of spirituality that emphasizes simplicity and absolute trust in God. The Little Way is a practical approach to Christian life, focusing on the idea that holiness can be achieved through small acts of love and devotion in everyday life, and that even the smallest acts of love can be transformed into a pure and effective form of devotion. Thérèse believed that by fully trusting in God and loving unconditionally, even in the most common and ordinary situations, believers could achieve holiness. While Saint Thérèse and Saint John of the Cross have different styles and methods in their spiritual approaches, both share the understanding that love for God must be pure and selfless. While St. John of the Cross emphasizes a more complex process of spiritual purification and detachment from sensory and spiritual consolations, St. Thérèse promotes a spirituality that is accessible and practical, based on childlike trust and unconditional love. 2. Date of death and final moments. St. John of the Cross passed away in the early morning of December 14, 1591. In his final moments, he demonstrated profound spirituality and devotion. According to reports, before he died, St. John of the Cross inquired about the Matins bell, which was the signal for the early morning prayers, and expressed his desire to sing Matins in heaven. This desire symbolizes his yearning for full communion with God, a central theme in his life and work. The date of his death is especially significant because it coincides with his liturgical feast day, December 14th. This coincidence highlights the spiritual importance of his passing, as if his death were a natural and sacred continuation of his life devoted to God. The celebration of his feast on this day is a way to acknowledge and honor his spiritual and mystical legacy, celebrating not only his life but also his ascension to heaven, as he himself wished. 1. Canonization. St. John of the Cross was canonized by Pope Benedict XIII in 1726. His canonization was an official recognition of his sanctity and his significant contributions to Christian spirituality. We have reached the end of another story full of interesting facts. Don't forget to leave in the comments which saint you would like to see featured on the channel. Until the next story.